So there are a few doubts coming up from the participants of this talk. So will I read it out to you?
Yes,
Okay. So we know that moving charge creates magnetic field, but relative to it, we say that it is moving. Uh, if we are moving relative to charge, then also we say it creates magnetic field.
that's right.
Okay. It's a question. So.
So what's the question?
It just says that we know that moving charge creates magnetic field, but relative to it, we say that it is moving. If we are
I
moving relative to charge, then also we see it creates a magnetic field.
Sir, my
Yeah.
question is that. Hello, sir.
So any relative motion. When a charge moves, uh, when a charge is stationary with respect to an instrument which you use to detect magnetic field, if it moves, it creates the motion creates a magnetic field. Now, whether the question is a relative, whether it is only the relative motion creates a magnetic field, or is there a way of talking about absolute motion of a charge, right? Is that what the question is?
No, sir. I want to say that if we are means on a means one frame that observer and the charge are both in steady state, then observer seems that it create no magnetic field. But if
Yeah.
the charge is moving with respect to that observer, then
Yes,
it shows that it create magnetic field.
that's right.
And in another case, if the observer is moving with respect to charge and charge is stationary, then also it seems magnetic field.
Uh, no, it doesn't generate a magnetic
Because
field.
sir,
But now it's a
it is
combination of.
moving. It is moving with respect to that. So how can we say that it is moving? Either it is we are moving with that.
See, when there is a charge, there are two fields. One is an electric field, and then there is a magnetic field. Okay, both fields are always present. So, if a charge starts moving, the electric field will change. A moving charge has a different electric field now, and then there is a magnetic field. So, it's a combination of these two fields which defines the motion of the charge.
But sir, if we are moving with respect to charge, then how can we know that it create does not create magnetic field?
It doesn't
Because
create a magnetic field; it has a electric field. When a charge is stationary related to us, it has only a electric field.
but sir, in real life situation, if we place the charge means when we are in means free space that we
We are in free
mean
space.
yes sir, the charge is stationary and we are moving with respect to that, and we see that and we only see that charge is moving, then also it create magnetic field.
No, you have to be careful here. When you say we see a magnetic field or we see an electric field, how do we see a magnetic field? We need a charge to see a magnetic field. To see a magnetic field, we need a an instrument which has charges in it, and we look at the motion of these charges to detect a magnetic field. So when we say we are detecting a magnetic field, we are looking at the interaction between two charges, a charge which is producing and a charge which is detecting. Okay, so and a uh, charge which is detected related to us, it has both
Sir,
field, electric field and the magnetic field. We
sir, I
cannot
have
have
one
just.
example. What I'm saying, sir, if we are in a means the charge is in a
Let me give
train,
you another example. See, you can
sir.
have a magnetic field without an electric field if you use a current in a wire, for example. There are no free charges. There are only a moving current, and which creates a magnetic field. Now we can ask the question: suppose we move with the charges, will there be a magnetic field? If you move with the charges, of course, those charges are at rest. But now there is an opposite current from the positive ions in the conductor. So that creates a new field. So that you have to consider all charges, both in the detector and the sources, and it's only a combination of electric and magnetic fields in relative motion.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Sir, the next question is, what is R in strain H in slide 35?
What is?
R in strain H. In strain
The distance to the source. The capital R there is distance to the source.
Okay. And he again says,
Sir,
please.
can I speak one more? What distance to the source from where?
See, we are sitting on the earth and trying to detect a gravitational wave. So this is why I was very careful to present gravitational waves in analogy with electromagnetic waves. Suppose you have a charge at a distance r from you, from your detector, from your antenna, and this charge is moving up and down, accelerating up and down, and it emits electromagnetic waves, and electromagnetic waves reach you and you can detect them from that distance r. The strength of the electromagnetic waves, the amplitude, reduces as the distance increase as 1 by r. The intensity, of course, reduces as 1 by r square, but the amplitude of the waves decreases as 1 by r. So the antenna can detect at an attenuated level at a distance r. That is a separation which I was talking about between the source of the waves, which is an electric charge, and the detector, which is antenna. The situation regarding gravitational waves is exactly the same. There's a black hole or a binary neutron star going around at a distance r. Gravitational waves arrive from there, attenuated as 1 by r. The amplitude is attenuated as 1 by r, and it moves a mirror on the surface of the earth. The R is same in both.
Okay, sir.
Okay, and he again asks, please tell us where we can learn the semi-classical derivations of gravitational waves.
See, what I showed you was a derivation. You can go back to the slides and see that. Is based on a simple analogy with electromagnetic waves, where I did not use anything from general relativity at all. Okay, all I used, the fact was when a charge or a mass accelerates, the field cannot change instantaneously everywhere. It takes some time because the perturbation can travel only at the velocity, maximum velocity of light. That's all I used to derive that formula. Now you can do the same derivation, exactly same derivation, in a more sophisticated way from general theory of relativity. And in general theory of relativity, what you do, you cannot directly derive it from Einstein's equation because that equations are non-linear and it's very difficult to solve. So you have to make a linear approximation to those equations. Assume that the strain is extremely small. Once you say that the strain is extremely small, you can, just like doing any linearization of any equation, you can do a linearization, and then you can easily derive the emission of gravitational waves from a source. That is in all elementary textbook of general relativity. It is described, but maybe the best, one of the best book is by Bernard Schutz on introduction to general relativity.
So good evening, sir. I have some 3 doubts.
Okay.
So the first one is on the torch and pendulum. So
Yeah.
the Cavendish experiment, which has showed the value of G, capital G, to be constant. So
Yeah.
they have done the experiment in Earth. So if suppose we do same experiment in Venus or Mars or elsewhere, will the value of G be same, or have the experimentalists or scientists have checked this before that?
Okay. Uh, it's an important fundamental question whether the value of the fundamental constants are same all over the universe. Okay, right? You can ask such a question, and there are people trying to, you know, constrain or experimentally see whether there is any small variations. Now you can remember one thing: we are not stationary in this universe, right? We are moving. The galaxy is moving, solar system is moving, Earth is moving, and so on. So when we say the value of gravitational constant here today on Earth, it is a point. It is not a fixed point in the universe. In the universe, it is moving by about 400 kilometers per second. No, the Earth, solar system, and our galaxy, and so on, is moving through the universe with respect to all the matter distribution in the universe at a enormous speed of about 400 kilometers per second. It's not meters, 400 kilometers per second. So just the duration, you asked me this question, whether G is constant. You took about 10 seconds to ask your question. We have already moved 4,000 kilometers in the universe in that time.
Yes.
And therefore, two measurements of the gravitational constant, if you did with the 10 seconds separation, they are actually separated by 4,000 kilometers in the universe. And you measure the same value. So you have reasonable confidence that the value of the gravitational constant is everywhere the same. But you cannot, of course, you cannot claim it absolutely, right? It may be different a billion kilometers away from you. You have no way of knowing.
Because I can't say it fundamental.
And you cannot claim that everything is same in the everywhere in the universe. Nobody can do that. It is an assumption. This assumption is called the Copernican principle. No point is preferred. It's an assumption.
So the next one is on what you have explained about the electromagnetism and the gravitation. So I have some doubt corresponding to gravitational field and the electric field. So let's say we have two mass m1 and m2. The gravitational field of mass m2 by m1 can be defined as limit m1 tends to 0 f by m1.
Tell me once more.
Yeah, so the gravitational field acting on mass m2 due to the mass m1 can be defined as limit m1 tend to 0 f by m1. Yeah, so this is the actual definition of a field. Like even in case of an electric field, we define the same. The electric field of charge q2 by q1 is defined as limit q1 tends to 0 f by q1.
Why do you have to take it as 0?
Because that's the reason we say it as a unit mass, or we say as a point charge, that the charge q1 or the mass m1 doesn't affect the field that's been acted or that's been experienced by the charge q2 or the mass m2.
Okay, in that sense, yes.
Yeah, actually this is the definition that was there in the papers of where they define electric field. So what's my claim is, so here we put mass tends to 0, but as we say, like it's a very foundational question. Mass is a quantity and 0 is a number. So how could we put m1 tends to 0? So this is number one. Number two is
it's a limit. See, it's a limit. So when you say something tending to 0, the concept is very different from putting to 0. It's only a limit, right? It's a sequence and the limit of that sequence, which is not putting something to 0.
Yeah, so that's the reason I say like m1 tending to 0.
That's very well defined.
Yeah. So what's my claim is, is it correct for us to put M1 tends to 0? Because we can't actually put, like, we can't say this is 0. If
Yes.
0 mangoes or 0x makes sense.
So something tending to 0 does not mean putting the 0. It's a
Yeah,
limit,
so that's
limit operation.
Yeah, so that's
It is
absolutely
never
correct.
0. It is never 0.
Yeah, it's never 0. But if you see in operational, in case of calculus, we put the value to be 0 in order to make it operational. Right? For example, limit extending to 0
Take the
sin.
limit. You don't put to 0, even in calculus.
So for example, let us take limit extending to 0 sin x by x. So it is, we put 0 by 0 in order to show that it is 0 by 0. It's an indeterminate form. And then
therefore, we don't say anything more than that, right? We don't put something to 0.
Yeah, so we don't put it 0, but for it to be operational, we put it to be 0. Right?
On a computer, where will
Sorry?
you put it to 0? See, anyway, it is not related to this talk, but the operation of taking a limit does not mean that something is put to 0. They are two different things.
So if we even stick with that definition, M1 tending to 0 itself, it makes more sense to write a quantity which is equals a number into a quantity. That is, M1 can be represented as M1 equals to some epsilon into a capital M, where epsilon is some number, and it is right to write its limit epsilon tending to 0 f by M1. And this epsilon is some number that is very much lesser than 1, just slightly greater than 0, like the hyperreals. So
yeah, but what is the relation of this with what we discussed in the talk?
Yeah, so what is the discussion is that you have discussed about the gravitational field, and it's because the gm by r square comes on the basis of gravitational field. So this was something which I have been observing for quite a lot of time, the definition of the gravitational field, but it's not been addressed in this way, but it has been defined in the previous papers as this. So what's my claim here is, if we have epsilon, that is a term that is slightly greater than 0 but less than 1, the hyperreals, there won't be anything that's getting blowed off. Like it's similar to, like, how to say,
That's why I
like,
said
there won't be any singularity existing.
there is no singularity. Even in the standard thing, there is no singularity. It's a limiting operation. Anyway, this theoretical question can be completely discussed independent of whatever we discussed in the talk, right? See, that's why in one slide, if you notice, I said fields are theoretical. We can never prove. Nobody has seen a magnetic field. Nobody has seen an electric field. All we see is a response of a charge or a mass in the presence of another charge or mass. That's all we can see. That's all what is physically sensible. Rest is theoretical. We try to describe phenomena in terms of different elements, most of which are unobservable elements. Field is an unobservable field. Field cannot be observed at all. It's just a theoretical construct, what we construct from our pure imagination.
But sir, if we drop iron rust or iron powder close to a bar magnet, we see that they align themselves around the field line.
So that is not the field, right? What the iron filings have charged particles, electrons and ions and so on, so matter has aligned in the presence of some other matter. Charged matter has aligned in the presence of some other charged matter, and that we call a field. But all we have is a response of matter to the presence of matter. We call it a field, but we don't. Even if you assume there is nothing in between, suppose you have a magnet and there is another magnet at 1 centimeter away, one is pulling the other. We can also say magnet is pulling the other magnet to empty space without any field. You can make a theory of magnet attracting another magnet without the field. It's very complicated theory, but people have done all that. But it's called action at a distance. Yeah. People don't like it because people like to have something, continuous between one body and another body. At least imagine that. But there is no magnetic field or electric field or anything. We cannot observe. That's why I said space and time is just a metaphysical concept. There is no space and there is no time. Without any matter, we cannot talk about these things at all. Certainly time. You can imagine a world which is without any matter at all, then you will see that there is absolutely no way of talking about time.
Excuse me, sir. Like, aren't the concept of fields introduced to keep theory of relativity intact? Like, it states that no phenomenon can happen faster than the speed of light, or it cannot happen instantaneously. But take the case of electric fields, the forces act instantaneously. Like if there are two charges, the force exists. Aren't the fields introduced to counter that?
No, I mean, see, the concept of field was introduced by Michael Faraday. Like a magnetic field, he wanted to imagine something going through space and affecting something far away. Now, Faraday didn't have even basic mathematical education, but he imagined from his experiments the shape of such fields. What should be the shape of such fields in space? So he was one of the first person to use so much of the concept of a field. Later, when people like Maxwell formulated, then also these were formulated in terms of the properties, the mathematical properties the equations have. So the shape of these fields, the properties of these fields were given the same meaning, like a curl, like in fluid dynamics, these kind of concepts made sense. Circulating vector fields and so on. Same properties were given. We draw it like that. For example, we freely draw magnetic field lines. Magnetic field is not a set of lines which you can cut, right? They are not a set of discrete lines like that. There is nothing like that in space.
Yes, sir, but like if you consider the propagation of electromagnetic waves, the Maxwell derivation comes down to C. Like nothing can increase above C. Like no phenomenon can happen faster than C. That's what it.
Yeah, but even if there is no field, we can say I can move a charge here. I can just say that the effect of this should not appear anywhere at some distance away faster than a certain duration, faster than a particular velocity. But I don't have to have a field to talk about this. I can talk about the cause and an effect. I can say cause should not make an effect which is faster than c. I can construct such a theory. The theory will be complicated because mathematical tools will be limited, but it can be done. Professor Narlikar has done this with the Fred Hoyle with a great success. There's a book also written, Action at a Distance in Electrodynamics.
Can you tell the name of the book again, sir?
Action at a Distance, I remember. I think Electrodynamics also is there. Yeah. Narlikar and Hoyle and Narlikar.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, so the next question from Shilpa. Can you please elaborate charge of gravity once again? I mean, what is the origin of it saying so? Then further, we are saying that mass is the charge of gravity. How are we considering this then?
Yeah, this is a favorite topic of me, so of mine. So I will tell you what I mean. See, various concepts in physics come to us historically as people it is very much associated with the history of physics, for example. So mass was never seen as a charge of gravity, because even the realization that if you look at the Newton's law of gravity, that mass is a source of gravity, that came only 300 years ago, right? As mass as a source of gravity with a quantitative relation, gm by r square and so on. When people studied the phenomenon of electromagnetism, electricity, magnetism, and so on, that also had a source, which is called some name. It is called the electric charge. Later, we found that electric charge belongs to fundamental particles like electrons and protons and so on. So there's a history of such a thing. There is a positive charge, there is negative charge, and so on. All these complications were not there in gravity. Mass was a source of gravity. There's only one sign of mass, and so on. But if you look at from the point of view interactions, we have several interactions: electromagnetism, gravity, nuclear forces, and so on. Just each of these has a particular interaction, then each of them should have a source, and those sources can be collectively called charges of those interactions. So every interaction has some particular kind of charge. Electric force has electric charge. Gravity is generated by some gravitational charge. Nuclear forces is generated by some nuclear charge, and so on. So that's another way of naming these things. If things were very systematic, we would have done something like that. So when I say mass is the charge of gravity, whatever we would have called gravitational charge is exactly same as the quantity we call mass in physics. So in that sense, is what I am. It is in that sense I am using that term, and it has a wider meaning because if you look in electrodynamics, a magnetic moment. What is a magnetic moment? It's a tiny magnet. Just a small loop of current is what we call a magnetic moment. Now we can also ask the question, is there such a thing in gravity? We know that there's the equivalent of electric charge. Electric charge generates electric field. Similarly, a small mass generates gravitational field. So charge, electric charge, and a mass are the corresponding charges in electricity and magnetism. Just like a magnetic moment, a small loop of wire current. Is there something in or a rotating a spinning electron as a magnetic moment, we say, right? Similarly, is there something equivalent in gravity? What is the equivalent of a magnetic moment in gravity? You can ask the question. It turns out that equivalent is exactly the spin. The spin of a particle is an exact analog of a magnetic moment in electromagnetism. So we can call a spinning particle, the spin of a spinning particle as a gravitomagnetic moment. It is accurate, and the physics is similar. When you come to relativistic theories, these are all similar. So it's in this wider sense. I'm using these terms, and they have some profound meanings.
Okay, so at this point I have a doubt, like if we take mass as, like we are taking mass as the coupling constant to gravitational fields. Suppose we go to a hypothetical situation where there are no external gravitational fields and an electron is placed. We have the Coulomb's equation for that. So for this situation, is it fair to write the equation A equals F by M?
There is only, okay, I get the question correctly. So there's only one charge, is it?
Yeah, there's one charge and there's no external gravitational field.
Yes.
So is it still fair to write the equation F equals,
But
sorry,
which is
A
F?
equals F by M?
Where is F?
Sorry?
There is no F, right? There is no field at all.
No, there's no external gravitational field.
There is external gravitational field, yes. So you can write. Yeah,
No, I'm saying there is no external gravitational field, but there are Coulomb fields, like electromagnetic fields.
yes, yes.
Yes, so I'm asking, in this case, can we write A equals F by M, where M is considered to be the coupling constant to the gravitational field?
See, that's why I said the mass, there is no gravitational field, and still the Newton's law is valid. Newton's law is valid for all forces. It has no reference to gravity at all. Newton's law has no reference to gravity at all, right?
Yeah, but the mass that is used, like A equals F by M, that M mass is considered to be the coupling constant to the external gravitational field.
No, so that is why I talked about the dual role played by mass. When you talk about Newton's law, F by M, it is not even called mass, it is called inertia. We call it mass loosely, but it's called inertia. When we say energy is equal to half mv square, that m is actually inertia. Because there is no gravity relation to gravity, there is no reference to gravity.
No, I am asking this because for this gravitational force, gmm by r square, and when you take out the acceleration, the m cancels out.
Yes.
Yeah, so that is the reason I'm asking. Like you said, that m is considered to be the charge of the gravitational field.
Yeah. So when you state the Newton's law of gravity, it is analogous to the Coulomb law of electricity, electric forces. Just like electric charge is there, there should be a charge for gravity, which is called mass. That gmm by r square, gm1 m2 by r square, that m is called, it can be correctly called the gravitational charge. But when you talk about Newton's law, it's the same. We assume that it's the same m which is appearing there as well. But m is doing a double role. It is appearing in the Newton's law of motion as well as the Newton's law of gravitation. These are completely independent in present physics. They have no relation. Yet mass is the charge quantity which is coming in both laws, not the electric charge. So there is something very different. There should be some basic reason. There should be a fundamental reason why the same quantity is appearing in two different unrelated things in physics, which is a puzzle which I talked about, which has no answer in present day physics. The answer to that fundamental puzzle is discussed in my paper, which I refer to, which I did not talk about, but I refer to, and it's also discussed in my talks in my YouTube channel. That is, what I'm saying is, I know the answer for that puzzle. Nobody else knows, but I know the answer for the puzzle. I have a definite answer for that puzzle. I have solved that problem, is what I'm claiming. That problem is 400 years old, as old as physics. Why is the same quantity appearing as a gravitational charge, source of gravity, in the Newton's law of gravitation, and also as inertia in the general law of motion? The answer to that puzzle you can find from my other talks.
Okay, thank you, sir. There's one person asking how he can connect with you after this talk.
How,
Like He can connect with you after this talk. If
Well,
he has.
just send an email to me.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and
So,
the questions are always welcome.
yeah. So another question: does the universality of free fall imply that gravitational force is fundamentally different from other forces, and that looking for quantum explanation is of no use?
Of course, besides stress, gravitation looks fundamentally different from all other forces because it has properties which are not there in other forces, like the universality of free fall, for example. It will not happen if you have two charges, electron charge and the proton. There's an electron and a proton, which has exactly same charge in an electric field. They fall at different rates because their masses are different. What appears is a charge to mass ratio. So, in that sense, gravity is very different from all other forces.
Okay.
But there is no quantum mechanics involved in all this. This is more primitive. See, what is quantum mechanics? Quantum mechanics is the laws of dynamics for in situations where we have micro kind of particles, small quantities. We seem to distinguish between the micro world and the macro world in the sense there seems to be a slightly different laws applicable when we consider the dynamics of small particles and atomic particles in the atomic scale, and that's where we use quantum mechanics. But it's also a law of dynamics, like Newton's law. We are talking about how the physical state of a system is evolving with time. When we write Schrodinger equation, it is an analog of Newton's law of motion. So therefore, in quantum mechanics, what appears is also in the quantity m, mass, appears in quantum mechanics also. But there also it appears in the role of inertia. It has nothing to do with the gravity. So this problem of the dual role of mass as a gravitational charge and also inertia has to be solved at a level higher than all this. Then it will be explained why it is playing this double role in Newton's law as well as in Schrodinger equation. But quantum mechanics is not the place to look for a solution. The solution will be always in the domain of gravity.
Okay, Aditya, I hope that answers your question. Another question: please suggest some undergraduate level books for learning these.
Learning what? About gravitational waves?
Learning these. Yeah, I think so. Gravitational waves and stuff.
Oh, see, of course, now some textbooks are available on gravitational waves and so on. The theoretical part, of course, is, as I said, any elementary book, undergraduate level, Introduction to General Relativity, like Bernard Schutz's book and so on, gives a good introduction. But there are also a lot of tutorials available now, lecture notes and so on in the Caltech, for example. There are courses in general relativity. Some lecture courses I myself have given in IIT Kanpur, I think, available online. So there are a large number of textbooks, new textbooks being written. So there is no difficulty.
Okay. And Nishant Pawar is asking, are there any specific reasons behind choosing Gauri Bidanur as for gravitational experiments? What factors were taken into consideration while selecting this site?
Yes, see, the Gauri-Bidanur experiment was done 25 years ago, 30 years ago. And at that time, we needed a site where we could go underground, which means when you dig a well, there should not be water coming immediately. So dry place, a seismically quiet place, then also a place where which is isolated from large human activity. All this was available at Gauri-Bidanur, which is a village about 80 kilometers north of Bangalore. And then good support was available, which is necessary. You cannot go to a isolated village with no facilities at all and hope to do a physics experiment. So BRC operates a seismic array station at Gauri-Bidanur. Raman Research Institute has a radio telescope at Gauri-Bidanur. And we were also, with all the support, we could build a laboratory about 10 kilometers from all this and do the experiments. And for gravitational wave detection today, when we are talking about 4 kilometers long Michelson interferometers, which means one needs a large amount of land to build a gravitational wave detector. And we looked around all over India, and finally we settled on the place called Hingoli in Maharashtra. It is close to Nanded. There is a site which is of the required area, isolated and available, which is what is acquired for it. So that's how you choose some place. Of course, you also need to get the land without spending too much money. Physics experiments cannot get a very large amount of money easily.
Okay. So Sagarika is asking, in the experiment of the two reference frames, we know that gravitational fields vary with distance. So is the accelerated frame also being considered as varying or non-uniform acceleration? If in the theory, the accelerating frames has all the base properties and constraints of the gravitational field, then what causes the tidal effect to be special to gravitational fields only?
Yeah, see that when I showed those two comparisons of a freely falling under gravity and apparently falling in an accelerator frame, those two situations are supposed to be local, in the sense small enough regions of space, so that gravitational field can be considered as uniform and the acceleration can be considered as uniform. Of course, that is not the real situation. The real situation, gravitational field varies, and to mimic that, you also need varying accelerations. You need to stitch various reference frames together and build the whole global picture. That's what is done normally in physics. So you start with a local relation, a differential relation, and then stitch various relations at different points of space and build up the whole global thing. But the basic theory is local, formulated in terms of differential quantities which are valid only in small volumes. So in that small volume, gravitational field is a constant, uniform, and the acceleration is uniform. But in the gravitational field, even when it is uniform, however small the volume is, two objects which are falling, even in very small volume, they will come a little bit closer. So whatever even in the limit of tending to zero volume, the tidal force will not disappear. It will be smaller and smaller and smaller, and then the limit, it will be smallest. That's all.
Okay. Ram Kumar is asking another question. If in the talk you have talked that universe is not vacant, so can I make it in this sense?
Can you repeat again here?
Yeah. In the talk, you have talked that universe is not vacant. So can I make it in this sense? In Michelson model experiment said that there is no ethereal winds. Can static ether fill the universe?
In the Michelson-Morley experiment?
Michelson model experiment confirmed that there are no ethereal winds. So he's asking that can static ether fill the universe?
Okay. So now we are, of course, talking about another aspect. See, Michelson-Morley experiment, what did it really measure? You can ask that question. It was looking looking to see whether it can detect the motion of the Earth relative to the ether. Why did it think that light was supposed to be propagating in a medium called ether? So if light is propagating in a all-pervading stationary medium, and if you are yourself moving relative to that medium, in that medium, then the propagation of light from one point to a mirror and back will have a slight, in one way it is velocity c minus v, and in another way it is c plus v. Just like in the medium, if the wave is moving with the velocity c, and if the observer is moving in the same medium with velocity v, in one way the relative velocity will be c minus v, in the opposite way it will be c plus v. So the time taken to go from one point to another is L divided by c minus v in one, and L divided by c plus v in the return path. The total duration will have a 1 minus v square by c square, which is what Michelson was trying to detect. He didn't detect that. Therefore, the motion of the Earth through the ether, even if it is there, cannot be detected. That was the result of the experiment. It didn't say ether is not there. It just said if the ether is there, this was expected. This kind of signal was expected. It was not seen. Therefore, the motion related to ether cannot be detected. That is the result of the experiment, which can be interpreted in various ways. You can always say there is no ether. What's one experiment? One conclusion. There is another way of saying it. It is there is ether, but you cannot detect because there is some other physical effects has masked the effect, and that particular physical effect was speculated by Fitzgerald and Lawrence as length contraction. So if you look at the interpretations of the Michelson-Morley experiment, there are two interpretations possible. One interpretation, Lawrence interpretation, is there is ether. Velocity of light is not a constant. It is c minus v and c plus v. But length contraction cancels, masks this effect, and you don't see the net effect. There is another interpretation due to Einstein. Einstein said there is no ether. Velocity of light is a constant both ways, c that way and c when it is back. Therefore, there is no effect. Both interpretations are correct. In the sense, you cannot distinguish between these two with the Michelson-Morley experiment, which is a two-way experiment. So what do you do? This question is very important. Many textbooks tell you that Michelson-Morley experiment proved that either is not there. That is not correct. Both interpretations are correct. You can either say, I cannot detect motion relative to ether because some other physical effect has masked. It has compensated for the effect which was expected. In fact, you would be surprised to hear that in 1925, Michelson published 2 papers in Astrophysical Journal. In one paper, he calculates the effect of rotating relative to the stationary ether. Instead of moving straight, suppose the Earth is rotating relative to the stationary ether, what effect he would see in the propagation of light. He calculates that effect in a paper in 1925, much after special relativity. Yeah? So Michelson was convinced that ether theory has not been ruled out. The second paper, which is written by two people, Michelson and his collaborator Gale. It's called Michelson-Gale experiment, where he used a 1 kilometer sized interferometer and measured what effect will happen if the Earth is rotating relative to the stationary ether. And then he says he has detected the motion of the Earth, rotatory motion of the Earth related to the stationary ether. In 1925, Michelson's paper. So that doesn't mean that ether is there. No, I'm saying if you assume a ether, the experimental results are consistent with that.
I think there's like no more doubts. If anyone has any other doubt, please post. I don't think so there's any, and if anyone has, I think they will surely mail you.
Yeah, and anyway, many of these questions which you asked about Michelson-Morley experiment, all that answers to all that is contained in that paper which I referred to. It is open access. You can go and look at it, and you will also see some surprises.
Like your paper on
Yes.
gravitation.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so no one is having any other doubts, so it's time to conclude. So that was a very informative and indeed a very clear talk. And we are extremely happy to have you once again in our event. And I, on behalf of Physics Club, thank you, sir, for being a part of the Sarabhai online lecture series and giving us such a beautiful presentation.
Yeah, but I'm still a bit sorry that I couldn't spend enough time to derivations and so on. But I hope you got a flavor of this.
Yeah, we definitely. It was like the clarity of your thought was really like it was more clear than the other talks. It's my personal opinion. Okay, and I would also like to thank our faculty advisor, Dr. Kamlesh Pathak, the head of our physics department, Dr. D.V. Shah, and all the other faculties of the department, without whose support this wouldn't have been possible. And last but not the least, I would like to thank you, the audience, for attending this talk and coming up with these brilliant doubts. It was such an interactive talk. So we conclude over here. I request Dr. Unnikrishnan, all the faculties of physics department present, and the members of Physics Club to please stay back in the call for a while the others may leave now. Yeah. Thank you.
And thank you very much. And please look at my YouTube talks where a lot more conceptual issues are discussed. And there's also other talks on the same issue, same things about gravitational waves and so on. So all this information is available in other talks as well. Some of them might be slightly differently presented. So you can get an idea about all this. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.